In this demo, we'll continue with returning data from the repository when requesting resources. We're still looking at our cities controller. Let's implement the getCity action. And this is going to be a special one. Seeing our repository can return a city with or without points of interest, we can now allow the consumer of the API to choose whether or not to include them. We haven't encountered something like this before. So how do we pass that additional parameter, include points of interest, to the API? Well, the first thing we need to do is accept it in the parameter list. Let's name it include points of interest. And let's give it a default value of false. As we know by now, we also have to make the action async. There we go. Then we asynchronously call into the repository to get back the city with or without points of interest. For that, we call into getCityAsync, passing through the ID and the include points of interest variable. Obviously, we need to await this, so we get the result of the task instead of the task itself returned. And that should give us the city. The first thing we need to check is whether or not we actually got something back. If the city is null, we return a not found. And the rest follows the same principles as before. We have to map this result, either to a city without points of interest DTO or to a city DTO. We already created the mapping from the city entity to the city without points of interest DTO, but we don't have a mapping yet from the city entity to the city DTO. So we add such a mapping to our profile. In our controller, we can now use AutoMapper to execute the correct mapping. If the points of interest have to be included, we map to city DTO. And otherwise, we map to a city without points of interest DTO. One more thing, if we look at the action signature, we see that we stated that it will return an action result of city DTO. That is not completely correct anymore. It will still work like this. That's because the type value we pass through to the action result is only potentially used by other parts of the code, like the Swagger definition driving our documentation, to correctly generate itself. More on that in the module on documenting the API. But even though it will work, it is not correct anymore. And I prefer to be correct whenever possible. So in this case, I would suggest to return an iAction result instead of an action result of city DTO. This is a more generic approach, but it's also more correct in this case. All right, let's give that a try. Let's try getting a city without the points of interest. We've still got a request like that lined up here. Let's send that. And that seems to work. So far, so good. Now let's try getting one with the points of interest included. To do that, we have to pass a value of true for the include points of interest parameter. Passing those parameters to the action is done by using query strings. So we append a question mark to the URI, followed by the name of the parameter, so include points of interest, followed by an equal sign, followed by the value for the parameter, in this case, true. Let's click send. And we hit an error. It looks like we are missing a mapping. And if we scroll down a bit, we see that the missing mapping is one from the point of interest entity to the point of interest DTO. And that makes sense. We added a mapping from the city entity to the city DTO, but as the city DTO includes a list of points of interest, the mapping fails because AutoMapper doesn't know how to map that. So let's add a new profile. We name it Point of Interest Profile. We let it derive from profile, from the AutoMapper namespace. And in the constructor, we create a map from a point of interest entity to a point of interest DTO. All right, let's give that another try. Let's send that same request again. And this time it does work. We got back New York City, including the points of interest. What you also notice is that we again have a number of points of interest variable here, That's because we're now using the city DTO and not the city without points of interest DTO. So far for that. There's two more actions in which we get data. Getting the points of interest for a city and getting one specific point of interest. Implementing this will be almost the same as what we just did, yet still different enough to give a bit of attention to it. Let's open the points of interest controller and let's inject a repository and a mapper. We store both in a private read-only field and add the necessary null checks. There we go, and we get rid of that city's data store. Now let me clean this up a bit. There we go. Let's start by having a look at our action to get the points of interest for a specific city. We can get rid of our old code. This won't work anymore as it's still using the city's data store. The first thing we want to do is call into the repository to get the points of interest for this city. As this is an async method, we want to await it, and to be able to await something, we have to mark the action with the async modifier. So we do that, and we make sure it returns a task of action result of IEnumerable of point of interest DTO. And with that, we've got the points of interest for a city. And this is where we have to provide something extra. We need a way to check whether the city exists or not. And this code doesn't tell us that. Let's have a look at the repository again. Get points of interest for city async is going to return an empty collection if the city exists. But it will also return an empty collection if the city exists but there are no points of interest. The former warrants a 404 not found response, while the latter requires us to return an empty list. Now, we do have a method in the repository that returns null if a city doesn't exist. getCityAsync. We could definitely use that, but it will potentially return a city object we don't really need. So I prefer to take a slightly cleaner approach and add an additional method to the repository that returns true if a city exists and false otherwise. So we add a method, cityExistsAsync, and in it we call into anyAsync. That will return true if a city with this ID is found and false otherwise. We also have to add this signature to the contract. There we go. Back to our controller. We can now first call the cityExistsAsync method and return a not found if we get a value of false back. As we've been logging these issues before, we'll keep on doing that. The rest follows the same principles we already learned about. We map the entities to DTOs and return it. Before we start testing, we'll immediately add the implementation to return a single point of interest. First, we make the method async. Now we can get rid of this old code here. If the city doesn't exist, we return a not found. Then we try to get the point of interest. If that doesn't exist, we return not found as well. The reason why I'm not using something like point of interest exists is that we are effectively going to use this point of interest afterwards. That wouldn't be the case with a city object. So we've now got a point of interest entity. All that's left to do is map it and return it. Alright, let me comment out the rest of this controller. We will completely implement it during the rest of the module, but I'd like to be able to test what we've done up until now already. That won't be possible if we don't comment this out, because these methods for manipulation still use the city's data store. There we go. And let's give that a try. First, let's try getting the points of interest for New York City. And we indeed get back the points of interest that are in our database for that city. If we try an unexisting city, we should get back a not found. And that is indeed the case. That's thanks to our additional check to see whether or not the city exists. We can also get back one specific point of interest. Still works. And if we try the same for an unexisting city, this won't work either. We get back a 404 not found. So far, so good. With that, we've introduced the repository in our controllers and we're now fetching data from our database through it. Now we can continue with manipulating resources through our repository. Let's start with creating a resource.